I thought there would be some response because of the, as I say, the transgressive quality of seeing an Ivy League professor engaged in discussing something that has a certain illicit quality about it. But I had no idea that it would have the kind of success that it has experienced. I don't really understand it, but I'm not sorry.
Thanks very much for talking with us.
You're welcome.
Tuesday, Alan Dershowitz and Noam Chomsky debated how to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at Harvard University's Institute of Politics. This is an hour and a half.
Thanks, Tim, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. One of the missions of this school is to train public leaders to think hard about critical issues of the day. Certainly this evening, we are going to be addressing, confronting, and thinking hard about some of those issues as they relate to Israel and Palestine. Tonight, our critical issue is, to bring it to point, is Israel and Palestine after disengagement? Where do we go from here? As we know, both parties, Israelis and Palestinians, are shortly headed toward elections. In January for the Palestinians, probably in late March for the Israelis. Since the disengagement in August, both sides are wrestling mightily with their internal constituents, some on board for peace, some reluctant, some not so anxious at all to proceed with what is still an unknown and uncertain future. But there is a ray of hope. If you've read the papers in the past couple days, an Israeli-Palestinian peace soccer team, a joint team, has showed up in Spain. What's interesting about this is that beneath the rhetoric, beneath the politics, there is a level of humanity in both suffering and hope that these two peoples will soon join hands and produce a better and a different path. And tonight, I think we're here to discuss what that path might look like. What I want to do before introducing our two speakers is to make clear what our format is for this discussion. First, each speaker will make a 10-minute opening statement on the topic. Then, for approximately 45 minutes or so, I will moderate a question and answer session from you, the audience. We will conclude with 2-minute closing statements from each speaker. And while I encourage you to ask any question you deem appropriate to Professors Chomsky and Dershowitz, and I include in that tough questions, I also ask, for the sake of the audience, that you be brief and respect the right of each speaker to respond as well. Please remember that civility is the cornerstone of our democracy and certainly a hallmark here at the Forum. Born in Brooklyn, Professor Alan Dershowitz graduated from Brooklyn College and Yale Law School. At Yale, he graduated first in his class and served as editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Review. After clerking for Chief Judge David Breslin and Justice Arthur Goldberg, he was appointed to the Harvard Law faculty at age 25. There wasn't even time for you to join a mid-career program here at the school. And he became a full professor at 28, the youngest in the school's history. When not teaching students, he found time to be one of the country's most accomplished defense lawyers and authored over 20 books. His latest, A Case for Peace, How the Arab-Israeli Conflict Can Be Solved, has received favorable reviews from former President Bill Clinton and Middle East negotiator Dennis Ross. At Harvard Law School, where he is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law, Professor Dershowitz teaches courses in criminal law, constitutional litigation, civil liberties and violence, legal ethics, and human rights. Professor Noam Chomsky, son of a Hebrew scholar, Professor Chomsky was born in Philadelphia. While he acquired his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1955, Much of his research leading to his degree was done here at Harvard between 1951 and 1955. In 1955, he joined MIT, and in 61 was appointed full professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics. From his articulate opposition to the Vietnam War in the mid-60s, to his book Manufacturing Consent in 1988, and to his even more challenging text, 9/11, published after the terrorist attack that year, Noam Chomsky has never retreated from taking on the most pressing issues of our day. Professor Chomsky is the Institute Professor of Linguistics at MIT and teaches classes in linguistic theory, syntax, semantics, and the philosophy of language. Before we begin, and to set the appropriate tone and context for this evening, I'd like us to have a brief look at a short clip from a forum event last year.
Hi, my name is Laura Daggy. I'm a junior in the college, and I was wondering, as a leader who is internationally recognized in the struggle for peace, what advice do you have for the rising leaders of our generation?
First of all, don't be like us. Be different. You know, personally, I have very little patience for history. I believe that to imagine is more important than to remember.
Let me just repeat that so that we have that as the tone and the context for our discussion tonight. And I quote from Shimon Peres, "First of all, don't be like us. Be different. Personally, I have very little patience for history. I believe that to imagine is more important to remember." So tonight, let us imagine what should be the next steps in the process of achieving peace in the Middle East. For your knowledge, a coin toss conducted by the Harvard Speech and Parliamentary Debate Society has determined that Professor Dershowitz will speak first for 10 minutes. After that, we will go directly to Professor Chomsky, and then the floor will be open. Professor Dershowitz.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be participating in a debate with a man who has been called the world's top public intellectual. My connections to Noam Chomsky go back a long time. In the 1940s, I was a camper and he a counselor in a Hebrew-speaking Zionist camp in the Pocono Mountains called Camp Masad. In the 1960s, we both worked against the Vietnam War. In the 1970s, we had the first of our many debates about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I advocated ending the Israeli occupation in exchange for peace and recognition of Israel. He advocated a one-state solution modeled on Lebanon and Yugoslavia. We debated again in the 1980s and the 1990s. I have the text. I hope that our once-a-decade encounter will continue for many decades to come, though I doubt we will agree with each other. The debate today occurs at a time of real potential for peace. Shimon Peres, Israel's elder statesman in the peace camp, today quit the Labor Party and announced his support for Ariel Sharon in the upcoming election. Quote, "In my eyes, it is not a problem of parties, but a problem of peace. How to create a strong coalition for peace. The elements are now in place for a real peace." As I wrote in The Case for Peace, when the Palestinian leadership wants a Palestinian state, more than it wants to see the destruction of Israel, there will finally be a two-state solution. The untimely death of Yasser Arafat makes the two-state solution a real possibility. I call Arafat's death untimely because if it had occurred 5 years earlier, we might now be celebrating the anniversary of Palestinian statehood. Arafat's decision to turn down the Clinton-Barak plan for Palestinian statehood was characterized by Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia as, quote, "a crime against the Palestinians, in fact, against the entire region." The crime and the death that it needlessly caused can never be undone. But this is a time to move forward and to assure that the crime is not repeated. The time has come for compromise. My friend Amos Oz, the great novelist and leader of the Israeli peace movement, has said there are two possible resolutions to a conflict of this kind: the Shakespearean and the Chekhovian. In a Shakespeare drama, every right is wronged, every act is revenged, every injustice is made right, and perfect justice prevails, but at the end of the play, everybody lies dead on the stage. In a Chekhov play, everybody's disillusioned, embittered, heartbroken, and disappointed, but they remain alive. We need a Chekhovian resolution for the Arab-Israeli tragedy. This will require the elevation of pragmatism over ideology. It will require that both sides give up rights. Giving up rights is a hard thing to do. It will require that each side recognizes and acknowledges the pain and the suffering of the other. And it will require an end to the hateful attitudes and speech that some on each side direct against the other. Sometimes it's better to start at the end. The ultimate solution is not as much in dispute these days as is the means for getting there. I believe that even Professor Chomsky and I have the same basic agreement about a number of very important elements of what a pragmatic resolution might look like. Professor Chomsky now acknowledges that the two-state solution may be, quote, the best of the rotten ideas around. I'll settle for that. He also seems to acknowledge that those who advocate the so-called Palestinian right of return are pandering to their people and misleading them into believing that there is yet another weapon, a demographic weapon, that can destroy Israel. I think we both agree that Jerusalem should be divided essentially along demographic lines, with the Palestinians controlling the Palestinian population and Israel controlling the Jewish population, that the borders between Israel and the Palestinian state should be based roughly on the UN Resolution 242, that Israel properly ended its occupation of the Gaza, and that it should end its occupation of all Palestinian cities and population centers on the West Bank, that terrorism must stop, and that the Palestinian state that results from this peace must be as contiguous as possible and economically and politically viable. There remain considerable differences between us, and more importantly, between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority, that must resolve these issues and actually sit down and make peace. Some of these differences are attitudinal. I believe that peace is a realistic possibility, whereas Professor Chomsky apparently believes there is no chance for peace, at least as reflected by the German title of his new book, Keine Chance für Frieden, which translates as No Chance for Peace, Why a Palestinian State is Not Possible to be Established with Israel and the United States. I hope you're wrong. Other differences are quite specific, relating to precise boundaries and considerations that are quite important, the devil always being relating to precise boundaries and considerations that are quite important, the devil always being in the details. I strongly believe, however, that there is a genuine will for peace on both sides now, and that the pragmatic differences can and will be resolved. And here I think the Academy can play a very important and positive role in fostering peace. At the moment, I'm sad to report that many academics around the world are contributing to an atmosphere that makes peace more difficult to achieve. They are encouraging those Palestinians who see the end of Israel as their ultimate goal to persist in their ideological and terrorist campaign. By demonizing and delegitimating Israel in the international community and on university campuses throughout the world, they send a doubly destructive message to those who must make peace on the ground. To the Palestinians, the message is don't compromise. If you hold out long enough, the next generation of leaders will buy into your efforts to delegitimate Israel and will give you the total victory you seek. To the Israelis, the message is whatever you do in the name of compromise, you will continue to be attacked, demonized, divested from, boycotted, and delegitimated, so why make the compromise efforts? As I travel around college campuses in the United States, I notice a stark difference. Many of those who support the Palestinian cause tend to be virulently opposed to Israel, comparing the Jewish state to Nazism and apartheid, comparing Shimon Peres to Hitler and Idi Amin, calling Israel the world's worst human rights violators, and suggesting that Israel should be flattered by a comparison with the Gestapo. These are all quotes, the Amin Hitler quote from Professor Chomsky.